Hello and welcome to lesson 23. If you have a look at the title for this lesson, you'll see that there are lots of things, that there are commas, that there are transitions, that there are examples of transitions, such as however, therefore, and similarly. And yes, if I was going to talk about this in detail, this lesson would go on for quite a long time. But I'm going to focus on one specific thing that you can do straight away to improve your writing. And this one important thing you can do is based on how you use commas. Now, commas, not just in legal writing, but in all kinds of English writing, commas are often misused. People don't quite know how to use commas properly, and within a legal context, this is a problem. Not only does it lead to misunderstanding or potential misunderstanding, but that misunderstanding has very often legal consequences. And there were some famous cases based on comma use in America, in Canada, cases which were worth $1 million, $10 million, and various other amounts of money, all about where the comma is and what that sentence means with that comma or without a particular comma. So comma misuse does have legal effects, and therefore we do have to think about them. But this video is not about that per se. It's about something that's going to make your writing more readable, because of course we're thinking about the reader. And this is an easy to learn simple rule for you to use commas correctly in one particular instance. Now, I say that commas are often misused, and without going into too much detail, it's because there are no specific rules or no concrete rules or no set rules which are agreed upon amongst the English-speaking world. And if you have a look at different style guides, for example, you'll see that they approach commas from a different perspective. Some style guides would say please use commas here, some style guides would say don't use commas here, and so because of this disagreement, it does allow for a certain amount of flexibility, which then builds into the problem of potential legal consequences of getting comma use wrong. But as I said, I'm going to be teaching you one simple rule about how you use commas and transitions or linking devices or whatever you want to call them. So enough of the introduction, let's get stuck into it. So now I'm going to start talking about the words like however or therefore or similarly, which are the three words that we're going to have a look at in this lesson. Now, depending on which grammar book you look at, these words could be called different things. So they could be called transitions, they could be called linking devices, they could be called discourse markers, they could be called connectives, they could be called flow words. There's lots of different ways to describe these words. And of course, they're not just words. They could also be phrases. So for example, however is one word, but the phrase following our meeting yesterday is a connective, but of course it's not just one word, it's a number of words. And sometimes that introductory phrase, that linking phrase which connects what was said before to what comes next, could be even as much as 10 words, 12 words, 15 words, or in some cases even more. So it's really important to be able to identify what that is. And of course, in English there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these linking devices. Some will be more popular, some will be less popular. And there will be those that in legal English or in plain English or in business English you should not use. For example, notwithstanding. There's plenty said about why notwithstanding is such a terrible linking device to use. I won't go into detail here, but suffice to say, trust me, we should not be using notwithstanding in our writing. But there are some very common ones. For example, however, which suggests contrast, therefore, which suggests result or conclusion, and similarly, which means, well, it allows us to talk about comparison in some form. But there is one rule, getting back to commas, there is one rule about commas that we can use with all of these linking phrases. And it's all about the position of these linking words. Have a look at this example here. It says, the figures, however, were disappointing. From a writing point of view, what's the problem with that sentence? The problem is, and this goes back to what we were talking about in the last lesson when we were talking about the quasi-passives and the by clauses, is that the position of the linker stops the reader. The reader doesn't want to be stopped in the middle of a sentence, particularly not a short sentence, to then think about some kind of language function or language device. So the reader would read, the figures, however, were disappointing, and that's a stop, that's a pause, and there doesn't need to be that pause, because without the pause, we have a flow. With the pause, with the break, we break the flow, and that has an effect on the reader. So how can we change this? Very simply, we can put the transition at the beginning of the sentence. However, comma, the figures were disappointing. Now you can see here that there is a gain, if we can say that, of 1 comma. So we use 1 comma less, and you might think that's not a big deal. But when you consider a whole document, then that's a lot of commas that you might not now be using, and much better flow to all of your sentences. Now, I know what you're going to be saying. You're going to be saying, well, this is how we speak. Yes, you're right. That's how you speak. But it's not how you should be writing. Speaking and writing are 2 different forms of communication. And in speaking, we can get away with a lot. But in writing, we can't. Remember, when we're speaking to someone, we might also have to think about body language, and body language is a large % of our communication, and that shows the person what we mean to say. However, in writing, we forget about body language, and so then we've got lots of other things to think about. But one way we can make our writing easier to understand is if we become a little bit more disciplined with how we use these linkers. So the idea is quite simple. If you're going to use a linker, and I'm pretty sure if you think about your writing, you'll see that you will use the same linkers time and time and time again, which means that this issue is easy to identify. Make sure that the linker doesn't go in the middle of the sentence. Make sure it goes at the beginning of the sentence, and that way you still have the effect of the linker, but the sentence has much better flow, and you're 1 step closer to using commas a lot more accurately, let's say. Okay, so what are the teaching tips for this lesson? First of all, use commas in this particular case with linkers correctly and sparingly. These simple changes, when you take into account the whole document, or indeed all of your writing through the course of a week or a month, will make a big impact. Help the reader to read. This is what we're doing. We're always thinking about the reader, and we're trying to make life for the reader as easier as possible. So help the reader to read. Don't stop them mid-sentence, and be aware that there is a difference between speaking and writing. So one last thing to say, which I haven't popped onto the board behind me, is that, as I said, I think for the gerunds lesson a couple of lessons ago, make a list of in that case I was talking about nominalizations, make a list of the common nominalizations you use and put that somewhere near your computer so you can see them. So when you use those nominalizations, then you can quickly see that and think about using a different form. It's the same thing with linkers. Make a note of the linkers you very often use, put it somewhere near your computer so you can see it, and then as you're writing, go back and check those linkers and make sure you're using them at the beginning of the sentence with 1 comma correctly. Okay, time for some questions. Now, these questions are going to be simple, and the reason for that is that I want you to start thinking about the problem and start developing good habits. So all you have to do is things like this. Put the transition at the beginning of the sentence. So you'll see a question like, the figures, however, were disappointing. All you have to do is write, however, comma, the figures were disappointing. All you have to do. And you'll see a link to the questions if you're watching this on Patreon underneath this video. Okay, so do the questions and then quickly have a look at my answer video.